Okay, here in lesson 3 of week 4, we confront a very serious question, which goes to the refutability of our arguments and the arguments of others. Now, most people believe that an argument that contains facts is irrefutable, but that begs the question as to what are facts. So let's examine what a fact is and how we can insulate ourselves from being hoodwinked and being dragooned into accepting something that is not a fact, but is claimed to be so. Most people think that a fact is something that is irrefutable. Well, as Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, said in 1963 in his Conjectures and Refutations work, a theory which is not refutable by any conceivable event is an unscientific theory. Unscientific theory. Irrefutability is not a virtue of a theory, as people often think, but it is a vice. What does that mean? Popper is attacking the conventional notion of sufficient proof through inductive reasoning. To this point, we have been considering mostly deductivity as our pathway to critical thinking. Now it's time to employ what Karl Popper says are the limits of induction, because there's a reciprocity between the premises of a deductive argument and the methods of proof for those premises by the process called induction. You'll remember from 20 distinctions for critical thinking at the beginning of this class that induction never guarantees us absolute certainty, whereas deduction does. But deduction is contingent upon the premises being proven to be factually true. So there seems to be a dilemma here between the inductive process and the deductive process. Not to worry. There are simple steps that we can take that can alleviate our problems with this relationship between inductive proof for premises and deductive proof for arguments. And we're going to cover cause, analogy, testimony of witnesses, fact checkers, induction itself, and always looking for assumptions. For instance, take the large question that's debatable today in the public marketplace about racism. Did you know that there are no races in human biology? Did you know that? So argues Professor Alan Templeton, PhD professor of biology in arts and sciences at Washington University. And in his published work, he claims that race is a real cultural, political, and economic concept in society, but it is not a biological concept. And that, unfortunately, is what many people wrongfully consider to be the essence of race in humans: genetic differences. There is nothing even like a really distinct subdivision of and in humanity. There are no races. And yet people are screaming, hollering, censoring others, canceling others, persecuting others, suppressing others, fact-checking others about something that doesn't even exist. There are no races in human biology. But don't take my word for it. This is step number one. Step number one in insulating ourselves against the dangers of people who claim to have facts. But instead, these facts are always suspicious because induction never gives us perfect knowledge. So don't believe, step one says, don't believe anything you hear and only half of what you see. Step two, unless you are prepared to do your own research on a given topic for debate, form no opinion on that topic until you have educated yourself. Step number three, check the sources for claims from experts. Do they have a political agenda? Are they in the pay of those who would profit from their testimony or who have themselves a political agenda? Step 4, check the evidence from cause by learning causal theories and their history. We cannot refute an argument based on cause and effect unless we understand the history and the range of philosophical views on causality. Now, we can't cover that in this course. I do give it a large treatment in the book, so make sure you read that section, which is noted of the pages from Reason, Argue, Refute. Step number 5, to avoid cognitive bias. Now, you know what cognitive bias is. Cognitive bias really means our prejudices, the things we want to believe, the things we want to think that we know. To avoid this, always look for evidence that is either contrary or contradicting whatever argument or theory or claim that you are considering. That's step 1. Whenever you hear a claim, look for counterclaims. Search for counterclaims. Evaluate both the claim and evaluate the refutations by contrary or contradiction. Step 6. Be suspicious of arguments from analogy. They are never exact comparisons to the thing originally being compared to in the analogy. Let me give you an example of this one. Take the argument, if I were president, then I'd be famous. I'm not president, therefore I'm not famous. Sounds like a valid argument. Wrong. A good way to use an analogy to refute that argument would be to say something like, if Princess Diana were president, then she'd be famous. Princess Diana is not president, therefore Princess Diana is not famous. Well, we know that from the observations from the tabloids and from the popular media, especially today, Princess Diana is famous in her own regard. So this exposes that this is an effective use of the argument from analogy. But the argument from analogy is considered to be a form of weak induction. The reason is that the two things being compared are not equal. Now, when considering ethical, moral, or aesthetic arguments, be aware of the following things. This is very important. Number 1, ethical and moral questions are difficult to formulate unambiguously and free of questionable presumptions. Arguments about justice, arguments about love, arguments about equity, arguments about equality, any of the social things that we are concerned with often carry with them value-laden terms, and we'll cover this later in our value-laden terms refutations. But be aware of that. Number 2, religious, social, cultural, political, and psychological biases cloud our reasoning and give rise to what we have just referred to as cognitive dissonance. So when we are considering, let's say, global climate change as being catastrophic, are we importing some buried assumption in our feelings, in perhaps our education? Perhaps we spent 16 years studying for a PhD in climatology, and we're convinced that the Earth is in some sort of jeopardy. Well, we have to identify your own prejudices. Write them out. Actually, just write them all out. Just put them down. And I encourage students to do this, to keep a journal of their life of ideas. It's in the book. Step number 3, the history of thought yields agreement only on the many options faced in formulating and demonstrating ethical and moral arguments. Step number 4, remember that while valid arguments are relatively easy to formulate, sound arguments on ethical and moral questions require acceptance of some starting assumptions that are themselves beyond universal testable proof. These are what we call the starting principles, which are assumptions for all ethical, moral, political, social, and psychological theories and arguments. And these basic first principles are not susceptible to inductive verifiability beyond a reasonable doubt. There's always another way in which they can be analyzed. There are always new ways to make these arguments. Always check the fact checkers. Today we have social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook and others that have hired fact checkers. These fact checkers are being paid to cancel your postings, to put little flags on them so that nobody will think that what you say is true. This is a grave injustice and an insult to the intelligence of critical thinkers, because a critical thinker doesn't necessarily think that because my brother or my sister or my mother even posts something on Facebook that it must be a fact. No, of course, that's ridiculous. Only morons, idiots, fools believe. But yet these Facebook, Twitter, social media platforms, they feel compelled to censor ideas, to repress ideas. But what they don't disclose is that these so-called fact checkers are being paid by them. And they also have their own political agenda. So these are the steps that you should take to confront evidence. This is how you should look at evidence as a critical thinker. And once you have done this, you're in a position to make a valid and sound refutation of whatever argument you have presented as your thesis argument. And we'll get to that in lesson 5.